I'm glad to have you join me for part 1 of chapter 8 in our Anatomy and Physiology textbook. It's about articulations or joints. So we learned about bones and bone tissue, and that's the tough stuff, and then we come to the weak link in the chain, the joints that connect the bones together. So we're going to learn a little bit about different types of joints. First, we'll look at a functional classification of joints. And then we'll look at a structural classification scheme for all the different joints in your body. So functional classification has to do with the degree of movement. Some joints don't move at all, which may surprise you. Usually people think of joints and they think of the really freely movable joints that allow you to operate your skeleton with your skeletal muscles, but synarthroses are immovable. We'll encounter them in just a few minutes. Amphiarthroses are somewhat movable, and diarthrophyses are freely movable. Now, amphiarthroses, that sort of gets a little bit nebulous because what constitutes some movement, but we'll see how it goes. Structural classification of joints. We have 3 categories here: fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. All right, fibrous joints are very tough joints made up of collagen fibers spanning the space between bones typically. Here's a suture. The bones of the cranium, the box of bone that surrounds your brain, are held together by sutures, like little meandering river-like interlocking seams between the plates of bone in the cranium, and then stitched together with myriad tough collagen fiber bundles. Extremely strong, immovable joints. Another type of fibrous joint is a syndesmosis. That means ligament joint. A ligament, of course, is a dense, regular connective tissue proper that connects bones to bones. So here we see that the collagen fibers there. And the tibia and fibula are used as an example here. The bones of your lower leg, they act as a unit. They're completely stitched together, both at the distal end and at the proximal end, we can't see, by syndesmoses. Gomphoses are fibrous joints that actually anchor your teeth into the pockets in which they reside, the alveoli, in the maxilla and mandible. So these are very, very tough, again, joints made up of lots and lots of collagen fiber bundles that connect the surface of the tooth to the bone of our jaws. Synchondroses, that's the second category in our structural classification scheme. You see the word chondro in there, and synchondroses are joints made up of cartilage. And there's 2 examples here. The epiphyses are separated from the diaphyses of long bones that are still growing in length by a slab of hyaline cartilage called the epiphyseal growth plate. So it's technically a joint between 2 bones, and so there's hyaline cartilage there, and we'll make a point of understanding what's happening. Oh, we did actually, sorry. In chapter 6, we learned about long bone growth, and that is just a reminder about the epiphyseal growth plate right there. Another type of synchondrosis or example is the rib 1 connection to the manubrium of the sternum. So that's like a bar of hyaline cartilage that connects those 2 bones together. The rest of this is an immovable joint. It has some flexibility, but it's immovable. The rest of the joints, the costal cartilages, do have some movement relative to the sternum, so they're not technically called synchondroses. Symphyses, another type of cartilaginous joint, involves connecting bones with fibrocartilage. We've already talked quite a bit about intervertebral discs. Well, the body of the vertebra are connected by cylinders of fibrocartilage, the toughest, heaviest type of cartilage, and that's what knits them together and also absorbs shock as we walk along. The stack of vertebra keeps bouncing up on top of one another. So that's a symphysis. Sounds like you're lisping. Symphysis with PH. Another symphysis exists at the place where the 2 pubic bones meet anteriorly. So if you feel in the anterior of your body, you feel all the soft surface of your abdominal wall, and as you continue to move inferiorly and press, you'll suddenly come to a bony surface there just under the surface. The pubic symphysis is called in the pubic bones. So there's a little bit of fibrocartilage there. And then we come to our third and final classification in the structural classification scheme, synovial joints. These are the numerous joints of your skeleton that allow you to move your body at will. So all these joints are diarthroses, freely movable joints, and they have some important characteristics which I've attempted to list out here on this slide. And I would like you to be able to talk about these pretty fluently without having to research anything. So pretty much study these terms for sure, as well as all the classification schemes. All right, first of all, the bones that comprise a synovial joint have articular cartilage on the ends of the bones that reside in the joint, or that make up parts of the joint, the condyles. So hyaline cartilage forms a super smooth surface on the bones, and then the entire joint is encapsulated. It's sealed right up by the so-called articular capsule. The articular capsule is composed of, right here, not the outermost part, but this whitish purple middle part right here. That's the fibrous layer of the articular capsule. If you remember our tissue discussion, it's dense, irregular connective tissue proper. And that's pretty tough stuff, and it gives a little bit of the stability to the joint. It kind of keeps it in position where it should be. But inside of that, there's a lining that's called the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane takes fluid from blood vessels in the joint capsule, the articular capsule, and secretes a lubricating fluid into this synovial cavity, the joint cavity or synovial cavity. So that synovial fluid lubricates the joints. It's very slippery. It has hyaluronic acid, a slippery type of glycosaminoglycan that is in there as a lubricant. Incidentally, the synovial fluid also is part of what feeds the articular cartilage, the hyaline cartilage here. As you may remember, cartilage is avascular, and so the synovial fluid is constantly being made fresh by the synovial membrane. It flows out into the joint, and as we work, our muscles work to move the skeleton around. The pushing and pounding of these two bones against one another kind of pumps the synovial fluid into the hyaline cartilage, driving nutrients deep into there for the benefit of the chondrocytes. And then the synovial fluid is constantly being replaced. So it's constantly being recycled and refreshed. So lubricant and nutrition for the cartilage. Synovial joints also have ligaments, collateral ligaments, or ligaments within the joint. Collateral just means around the joint, or ligaments within the joint that help provide stability for the joint. You can see just looking at the two ends of these bones, they look like they're each round. There's not much contact, surface area of contact. There's not really much to determine where those bones can be at any given moment. And part of the stability, or what determines that, is the collateral ligaments, and in some cases, ligaments inside the joint. So dense, regular connective tissue that surrounds this joint, and sometimes crisscrossing in every which way to add some stability, to define where the bones may or may not go. The joints, synovial joints, also have we've already mentioned, a lot of blood vessels, which we knew were in there in order to produce the synovial fluid. So you could say it has a rich vasculature. And finally, synovial joints have a lot of nerve endings, sensory receptors. And there's two reasons for that. One is to provide information to your cerebellum, to your brain, about the position and movement of all the joints. Because part of your brain has to plan the series or complex orchestrations of skeletal muscle contractions that can allow you to accomplish your movement or locomotor goals. If you want to move in a particular way, wildlife. So where were we? So yeah, nerve endings provide information about the movement and position of the joints to the brain for the purpose of planning muscle contractions, and then also possibly an adaptive evolutionary adaptation to prevent us from damaging our joints to the point where we become incapacitated. So if you bump yourself, let's say in the knee, in an area where you don't normally do so, you will suddenly become painfully aware of the number of sensory nerve receptors in the synovial joint. So that's an interesting thing. Here's a couple of structures that are associated with synovial joints, but not technically part of the joints. This little green grape, flattened grape-looking thing here is essentially some synovial membrane in the form of a ball, and it's kind of been flattened out here, but there's some synovial fluid inside of it, and it's positioned between parts of a joint or a joint and the neighboring structures, which would potentially rub when the joint is activated, or when the muscles move the skeleton around that joint. And so instead of rubbing, if you put a bursa in between two neighboring structures, the bursa will just roll back and forth between those structures, and there's no friction at all. And so bursa are a wonderful adaptation to prevent friction from occurring in joints and allow joints to move freely back and forth without any rubbing and inflammation. The tendon sheath is just sort of an elongated cylindrical version of a bursa. You can see this tendon of the biceps muscle wraps right over the head of the humerus and attaches onto the scapula just superior to the glenohumeral joint here, the glenoid fossa. And there's not much space in there beneath the acromion, and there's another layer of tissue here, the joint capsule, and so we don't want those two long, extended connective tissue structures to rub. So there's like a telescoping, wrapping, cylindrical wrapping the tendon sheath filled with synovial fluid around that tendon, so it just can roll the long way along that tendon and prevent rubbing. So a couple of adaptations to keep the joint moving smoothly without any friction and wear. So now let's talk a little bit about movements allowed by synovial joints, then we'll jump right into some particular synovial joints examples, and also some special movements that are allowed by synovial joints. We're going to name a lot of the movements in order to be able to speak efficiently with each other about body movements. All right, so if you have a joint that when the two bones move, they produce what's called a non-axial movement. That would occur when there's just a slipping of the two bones. There's sort of planar joint surfaces along one another. There's no axis around which the movement occurs. A uniaxial movement is a movement that does occur around an axis, some fulcrum point, but the two bones remain in one plane throughout the movement of this joint. Biaxial, just a little bit more freedom of movement. More than one plane of movement is possible between two bones. And multi-axial means there's really no limit. There's a tremendous degree of freedom of movement of two bones about a particular joint. So we'll name some joints that have these properties. Whenever we're talking about a particular synovial joint, be thinking about which of these terms describes the movement that's allowed at that joint. Types of movements, that's a little bit different, and there's some similarity. Gliding movement is what we call when we have that slipping movement, that non-axial slipping movement between bones that essentially have planar surfaces between them. That's a gliding movement that's allowed in those situations. Angular movements involve some movement about an axis, but not just any axis, as such that the two bones will form an angle that will change, either enlarge or shrink as the movement takes place between the bones at the joint. Rotation, there's essentially a pivoting of one bone relative to another during the movement of the joint. So no angle is growing or shrinking. You just have a spinning effect, essentially. So where would we find this gliding movement? Well, the bones of the wrist, called carpals, essentially have planar joint surfaces between them, and they allow gliding movement. It's non-axial movement between the carpal bones. The tarsal bones of the ankle are also considered to allow gliding movement. Angular movements, there's quite a few terms we may use to describe angular movements. If you think of two bones or parts of the body that relative to one another, an angle is decreased between them as the movement takes place. That's called flexion. Let me explain a little bit better what I mean by that using this illustration. If you draw an imaginary line through the spine, and then we draw another imaginary line through the neck and head of this woman in the head forward position, you can imagine an angle between the vertical line and this slanted line here, this inclination. And then if we move the head posteriorly into anatomical position, that angle is going to increase in value. The number of degrees between the vertebral column and the neck line through the neck is going to increase. That's called extension. So flexion reduces the angle, extension increases the angle. Once you reach anatomical position, if you continue to move the head posteriorly, that's called hyperextension, to distinguish between extension and this unusual thing happening in which it's not clear whether we're talking about the diminishing of this angle in the posterior or the enlarging of this angle in the anterior. So we're just going to call that anything moving posterior to anatomical position is hyperextension. The same can be said for the spine or the torso. We can flex the torso, moving anteriorly from anatomical position. We can extend the spine or torso, moving posteriorly toward anatomical position, and then moving beyond anatomical position to the posterior is hyperextension. Let's look at the appendages. When it comes to the arm, we're going to just accept that moving the arm anteriorly is called flexion. Moving the arm at the shoulder anteriorly is called flexion. We may begin from a hyperextended position, but as long as the arm is moving anteriorly, here at the side, that's going to be called flexion. If, on the other hand, we move the arm posteriorly, with it lying parallel to the spine, we're going to call that extension. Until we reach anatomical position, such as here, we could extend this now flexed arm to anatomical position, and then if we move it further posteriorly, that's called hyperextension. So more angular movements about the shoulder. How about the knee? If you reduce the angle between the femur and the bones of the lower leg, the tibia and fibula, that's called flexion of the leg or knee. And then if you increase the angle, once again, moving the lower leg back towards anatomical position, that's called extension of the knee or lower leg or just leg. You could say the same thing about the arm at the elbow. If you reduce the angle between the humerus and the ulna, that hinge joint at the elbow, moving the forearm anteriorly, in this case, if the humerus were to remain stationary, that's called flexing the forearm. And then if we return the forearm to anatomical position, that would be called extending forearm or forearm extension. Here's an unusual term, moving the arm in such a way as to describe a cone-like structure in space, an imaginary cone within space. That's called circumduction. Here's a very important one relating to the appendages of the body. If you move either the arm or the leg away from the center line of the body in anatomical position, away from the median plane, that's called abduction. And then if you move the limb back towards anatomical position, it's called adduction. Sometimes it's easy to get those two confused, but if you think of someone being abducted as someone being taken away, then we can remember that abduction means moving away from the body in anatomical position, and adduction means moving back towards the body. The ball and socket joints, as we'll discover, of the shoulder and hip allow us to do rotation of the humerus and rotation of the femur. In order to name those rotational movements, we need to just think about the anterior surface of the limb. So if the anterior surface of the leg moves laterally as the femur rotates, we call that lateral rotation. And if the anterior surface moves towards the center line of the body, towards the median plane, we'll call that medial rotation. Same thing with the arm. The anterior surface of the arm moves laterally as the humerus rotates. lateral rotation, and of course the reverse is medial rotation. As you turn your head to the side, if you quote-unquote shake your head, that's rotation also. It says rotational movement about the C1 and C2 joints. The joint formed between the atlas and axis allows for rotational movement of the head and the neck. Here's a special movement allowed at the forearm only. When the forearm is in anatomical position, you can see that the radius and ulna are parallel to one another, but the palm, the wrist, is attached to the radius bone, and so if you rotate the radius at the proximal end, and then the hand will flip over as the bone rotates, and it will form an X-like arrangement with the radius flipped over top of the ulna. So remember, the ulna is the medial bone, the radius is the lateral bone, and if we rotate the radius, it's going to flip the hand over, causing a movement called pronation. And then if we move the hand back towards anatomical position, so the palm faces anteriorly once again, that's called supination. There are 4 special movements allowed by the ankle, movements of the foot. If we move the foot in such a way that the dorsal surface, the anterior surface of the foot moves towards the shin, if you will, that's called dorsiflexion. And then if you move your foot in the opposite direction so that the plantar surface of your foot moves inferiorly, or quote-unquote point your toes, that's called plantar flexion. If you move your foot in such a way that the plantar surface moves towards the median plane, the midline of the body, in anatomical position, that's called inversion. And then if you move the inferior surface of the foot, the plantar surface, away from the midline of the body in anatomical position, that's called eversion. Special movements of the mandible. If you jut out your chin, move the mandible just straight anteriorly, that's called protraction. And if you move the mandible posteriorly, back towards anatomical position, that's retraction of the mandible. But the more common thing we do with the mandible is if you are going to chew, for example, you're going to elevate the mandible, bringing the rows of teeth attached to the mandible and maxilla into proximity. And if you are opening up your mouth to insert something in there or to produce the sounds of speech, that's called depressing the mandible. So don't say opening the mouth or opening the jaw or lowering the jaw or anything anymore, because now we're going to use technical terms. We're going to say depression of the mandible. Those are the special movements. And finally, a special movement allowed by the thumb relative to the rest of the digits is called opposition, something unique to the human anatomy. So that's the end of our part 1 of our discussion of chapter 8 about articulation. So join me as we continue on through our narration. We'll be looking at some specific joints of the body in a little bit more detail in part 2.